Wait, one last thing, it's just a pet peeve of mine, but people often ask that, well, if ADHD or SCT are not categories like pregnancy, but they're dimensions of human traits, then when does a person qualify for a disorder? If we all share these traits, which we do, we all have executive functioning. ADHD is just the lower end of the Gaussian bell curve. At what point along that curve, along that dimension, does a disorder begin? And Wakefield answered that for us more than a decade ago, when harm is posed to the individual. Disorders begin where impairment begins. So let me just take a moment and make a distinction that's often not made in clinical practice, but it's very important, I think, both in practice and especially in science. There are symptoms and then there's impairments. They are not the same. I often hear people say, oh, he got a low score of that test. He's impaired in working memory. No, he isn't, right? Those would be aspects of symptoms. They might be deficits, but they're not impairments. So here's the difference. A symptom is the cognitive or behavioral expression of your disorder. Distractibility, for instance, not paying attention at school. That's a symptom. Speeding with a motor vehicle. That's a symptom of adult ADHD. Then what's an impairment? It's the consequences. It's the environment kicking back. It's what happens to you when you act that way. You lose friends. Your grades go down. You don't finish your academic papers. You have more car accidents than other people. You lose your license more often than others do. That's the environment kicking back. So, impairments are consequences. Symptoms are cognitions and behaviors. And if you'll keep those two apart, you can then understand that when symptoms reach a level that they start to produce serious consequences to the individual, serious impairment to the individual, that is when a disorder begins. Disorders begin where impairments begin. To put it another way, just because you have a number of symptoms of ADHD or SCT doesn't mean you have a disorder. You could just have a sparkling personality, a vivacious, talkative, gregarious, engaging, impulsive individual, none of which makes you psychiatrically ill. But to the extent that you start to experience harm relative to other people, you have a disorder. And by the way, harm can be classified as three types. There is morbidity, which is injuries to you. You're more likely to be injured by your disorder. Physical morbidity. There is mortality. You're more likely to die if you have this disorder. Think of bipolar disorder and the high risk for suicide by adolescence and young adulthood. And the third is harm in a major life activity. You cannot function effectively like other people are able to do. And here we would look at school, work, peers, family functioning. And in the case of adults, of course, we would be looking at child rearing, driving, managing money, your ability to cohabit with other people if you choose to do so, marriage, for instance, and so on, besides your occupational functioning. So there are three kinds. There's morbidity, mortality, and then there is impairment in major life activities, harmful effects. And you only have to have one of those to qualify as a disorder. Now, I didn't go through it this morning, but ADHD meets all of them. You may not be aware of it, but certainly people with ADHD not only experience impairments in work and school and so on, they're 3 times more likely to be dead by 45 years of age. They probably have 7 to 10 years shorter life expectancy than other people. And certainly they have a high rate of accidental injuries starting out in childhood and progressing well into adulthood. ADHD is a major risk factor, for instance, for coronary heart disease, not to mention obesity, bulimia, and many other medical complications. So ADHD is a very serious condition. Many people aren't aware of the morbidity and mortality risks associated with it, but they are there, even if they're relatively small compared to things like cancer and heart disease and so on. They're there. ADHD is a public health risk because of its linkage to all of these other healthcare problems, not the least of which is suicide. So disorders begin where impairments begin, and we're going to want to be asking what are the impairments associated with SCT as well.